Hi, and welcome back to our Coldworking 101 video series. Today we're going to talk about flat lap grinders, or diamond laps, or horizontal lap grinders. Lots of different nomenclature for them, though they're basically flat lap grinders in various sizes. Now, you may think they're all going to be the same, but there's a lot of difference between these, and it's good to know the different options available and how they work together to make an educated choice as to which type of flat lap grinder is going to be the best for your process. So let's take a look at a couple of options that we have up on the table here. Now, the first thing you're going to notice with flat lap grinders is if they are single speed or variable speed. And that can make a big difference in what you're doing. Single speed grinders like this Maxi Lap here are going to go a single speed for both your grinding and your polishing stage. You won't be able to adjust it at all. That's perfectly fine as long as most of your stuff is pretty standard and you're just going to be grinding a surface on there from rough grind all the way to polish. If you're doing things that require a lot more precision, or if they're a lot smaller, sometimes you may want to look at a variable speed grinder where you can slow that grinder down a little bit. Going a little bit slower with the grinding gives you a lot more control over how the grinder is grinding your glass. Going really, really fast, like a single speed grinder, it tries to make a balance between grinding and polishing. If you're doing something small and precise, it may be going too fast and you can accidentally grind away a lot more material than you intend to. The other major thing to consider with your flat lap grinders is whether they are a direct drive system or a belt driven system. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about what that is. So if you'll take a look at our two tabletop grinders that we have on here, this 12-inch grinder and the 8-inch model that's very, very similar in design to this are both called direct drive systems. So what that means is the shaft coming out of this grinder that runs the wheel head is actually the shaft of the motor that's running the grinder. Since the motor shaft is the shaft of the flat lap grinder, it's going to have far less torque available to you than a belt driven system. So in practical terms, what that means is as you slow down this motor, this is going to have less power to move this wheel head. So if you're doing larger surface areas on here and you slow this motor down, putting pressure on this is actually going to slow down the shaft of the motor and slow the motor down. So you can actually slow down or even stop the wheel head on these. Even going at a faster RPM, if you put a lot of pressure onto a direct drive system like this or a smaller 8-inch mini grinder, you can slow this wheel head down or even come close to stopping it. Now you'll also notice with direct drive systems, they will typically have a fuse in the back. This is when you put too much pressure on this motor and it starts to slow down or even stop. To prevent damage to the motor, it will blow this fuse and your machine will stop and it won't work anymore. Most of the time there's no need to panic. You just basically need to pull this fuse and put a new one in. It's a safety measure so you don't burn out the motor by putting too much pressure directly on that motor, since it is driving the wheel head directly from the motor. So we have here our little 8-inch mini grinder that's very, very similar to the 12-inch model here in design. So we're going to take this one apart and take a look at how that direct drive system works. And all I need to do is really take my wheel head off. And I've already loosened the set screw underneath this, so this should slide right off of my shaft. Like that. And you can see what the shaft looks like on this little 8-inch grinder. It's a very small shaft. And I've already loosened the bolts underneath this grinder that holds the base plate in place, so I can lift the top section off. And you'll see that this is our motor that drives our flat lap grinder for our 8-inch mini lap. And that's the shaft on this grinder. So it's not very big. And you can see it directly attaches to the motor, and the motor drives the shaft because it is the shaft. So you can see there's no way to tap that to get any kind of threading on it. You can't get anything thicker because it's a really small shaft. And this gives you an idea of how to get more torque out of this shaft, you'd need a much larger, more expensive motor in this system since it's not belt driven and you don't have those change of pulleys to provide that torque for you. Now I know that was a lot of exposition on a direct drive, but we're going to take a look now on a belt driven system to see what the differences are. Now the maxi lap that we have right here that's available in both an 8-inch and a 10-inch is a belt driven system. You can see right away that our motor is mounted back here. It is not mounted underneath our wheel head. So if we'll take a look on the underside of this grinder, you'll see that this has a pulley system from the motor to the shaft that drives the wheel head of the grinder. Now the upside of this is you can have a smaller pulley here and a larger pulley here. And what that does is that gives you the ability to have a tremendously larger amount of torque applied to the shaft of this grinder. So the motor does not have to supply nearly as much power to move the spindle and provide torque and power to your wheel head as you're grinding. The upside of that, you can put a lot of pressure on these wheel heads, and the torque that is available from this pulley system and the belt driven system is going to keep this wheel head running without slowing it down. If you were to try the same thing with the direct drive system, you'd have to put a much larger, more powerful motor on this grinder to try and keep up with the torque demand of the extra pressure on the wheel head. So the belt driven system is going to give you a lot more torque with less power from the motor at various speeds. Now the maxi laps are a single speed system, but that does mean that you can put larger surface areas and more pressure on these wheel heads to grind your pieces because it is higher torque system with this belt driven system. So if you move to larger grinders like say the Covington freestanding 12-inch model, this is also a belt driven system. So underneath on this, the motor is in this back corner of the grinder and a belt goes around to the shaft that runs this wheel head. Now this again gives you a tremendous amount of torque to the shaft that drives your wheel head. These are a variable speed grinder as well, so even at low RPMs, you're able to have higher torque to keep this moving under pressure. The other added advantage of many of these Covington machines or any other larger flat lap grinder like the Steinert 24 or the Waterjet 24-inch grinder, if it is a variable speed model like this, the motor in here is actually going to be a 220 3-phase motor. That means it's got a tremendous amount of power and 3 legs to give you extra torque when it's under pressure. Now the nice thing about these variable speed controllers is they will input 110 60 hertz. So our machine here is plugged straight into a regular 110 outlet on our wall, but it transforms the power inside this variable speed controller to the 223 phase that our motor needs. The upshot, lots of power, lots of torque, so you can do very large, heavy pieces with a lot of pressure on these larger grinders without slowing them down, without bogging down the motor. This is pretty much true for the 12-inch, the 18-inch, the 24s from all the manufacturers when it comes to these larger grinders. So we've taken the front off of our 12-inch Covington lap to give you an idea of what the inside looks like. And you can kind of see down here, this is our belt. It goes back to our motor that's back in this back corner. So you got a belt-driven system with a smaller pulley on our motor back here, larger pulley on the shaft, so you get a lot of torque out of this motor. You'll also notice on these larger machines, you're going to have some maintenance things to deal with. Right here you may see I've got a grease fitting right there for my bearing that's on the lower part of the shaft. This one has a water feed sleeve in here as well that's going to have 2 bearings on there, and you see grease points for those. And up above, right underneath the wheel head on this grinder, there's going to be another bearing that's going to have a grease fitting on it. And these all need to be greased with a grease gun about once a year to keep these bearings running really smoothly and really well over the lifespan of the machine. That's about the only maintenance you really need to do on these belt-driven machines that are a little bit larger, be it the 12, the 18s, or the 24s, is to get inside and grease these fittings for these bearings about once a year. So with your grease fittings in there for your bearings and for your water sleeve, All you really need to do is get a little grease gun like this. You can pick these up on Amazon for 10 or 12 bucks pretty easily, and they'll come with the grease. It has just a little tube on here with a little pressure fitting on the end. You get the grease in there, it's a spring-loaded action, and then you just pump the handle, give it 3 or 4 pumps of grease into that fitting every year. This would probably last you decades to handle your machine and keep it running well. So really simple maintenance on these machines as well, which makes them very, very nice and easy to use in your shop. So after seeing underneath this machine, you can see that these flat lap grinders are not a terribly complicated piece of equipment. If you know a little bit of welding and can find a machinist to make you a wheel head and a shaft, grab a couple of bearings, you can easily build one of these yourself if you have the time and the energy and the wherewithal to do it. We even have lap plans on our website that you can download for free that will show you dimensions and what needs to go together to actually build one of these yourself. It's not a difficult machine. We've even had people that will take existing flat lap style machines like a pottery wheel and adapt that to diamond grinding. The only thing you have to really think about when adapting machinery that's not made for diamond grinding initially is about speed and balance. As you've already seen with a lot of these machines, you have variable speed models that can go a little bit slower or a little bit faster. Pottery wheels are going to go really quite slowly. The diamonds will still work on those if you wanted to adapt a pottery wheel to diamond grinding as a lap grinder, but they're going to work a little less efficiently. It'll take you a little bit longer to grind with them. The drawback to trying to speed up a pottery wheel with changing the pulley system between your motor and the drive shaft or your pottery wheel is that these were never meant or built to go at higher speeds, so they're not balanced for that. The shaft, the wheel heads, the bearings, none of those things are built for high speed operation on a pottery wheel. So at that point, you're almost rebuilding the entire thing to try and speed it up, and you're better off looking at maybe building your own lap grinder from scratch or just investing in one. But you can take like an old pottery wheel and adapt that as a flat lap grinder for your diamond disc with no trouble at all. So I know this was a quick video with a lot of information in it, but it's here just so you'll know when you start looking at maybe adding a flat lap grinder to your shop, there are some important things to think about in terms of the type of work that you do, the size of the surfaces that you need to grind, and how large they are. Smaller surfaces work really well on a direct drive system. They rarely require a lot of pressure. They don't need a whole lot of surface area to grab onto, so small surface area pieces, they work great on these little 8-inch and 12-inch tabletop models. The larger your surfaces get, the more pressure that you tend to want to put on your grinding disc as you're working, the more you're going to want to look at a belt-driven system that's going to give you the torque that you need so you don't get frustrated with your grinding experience. So you want to look at things that are not a direct drive system, but something that is more belt-driven, like these tabletop maxi laps or the more freestanding 12-inch laps or higher. So it gives you the information you need to be a little more prepared for your shopping experience.